So welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for joining this first webinar hosted by the Resilient Coastal Habitats ACAI. And as you've seen in the invitation, and of course prepared very well, Andy's today going to present the new guide to MPAs for sharks and rays and the importance of involving communities. We've set up a what we hope to be a very interactive webinar. So Andy will present, then there will be lots of room for questions. And I think, Alice, your question can be repeated then as well when everyone's there, because I think that's a pretty good one. Who's it for? How can we use it within the network? And then halfway, we'll go into breakout groups. So we'll split the group up in two to discuss two imaginary case studies. And Andy will explain more about that later. Then we'll do a wrap up, maybe very quickly on next ACI calls, and any ideas for other webinars are always welcome as well. And that's about the agenda for today. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. I think as you'll see, the community aspect of this is sort of an integral part of the guide. So this was a natural fit. So in terms of the sort of overview presentation, it really is an overview and with some additional information sort of around context for sort of some of the background studies that fed into this guide. But the guide itself is, if you've had a look at it, and it's deliberately designed not to be an overly technical document. There's important information that needs to have time spent to it, but it should be fairly standalone. In itself. So I think that's sort of one key point. So like the other tool that we released recently, and you know, when we come to do the case studies later, if you do have a copy of the electronic copy of the guide that you can refer to, you might find that useful, but it shouldn't be essential. And there are also links which I will make to the two other shark tools that we've released in the last couple of years, one on tourism, and one just a few weeks ago, this rapid assessment toolkit, which will be useful for sort of research elements. But again, there's no reason for you to have them for hand for this call. This is sort of much more of an introduction. So both this and the rapid assessment toolkit are collaborations with James Cook University. It was very fortuitous that when we had this initial idea for this MPA guide, when I contacted Professor Colin Simpendorfer, who's the IUCN Shark Specialist Group on sharks with this idea. They had already received funding for a major project looking at MPAs and sharks. So we've been able to benefit from some of the original research that project has done. Some of the papers have already come out of that. And moving forward, there will be some software that will be another very useful aspect in terms of actual planning. So in terms of why do we need this guide, I guess most people on this call are fairly aware that sharks are in crisis with populations declining rapidly, and that there's a variety of overlapping potential objectives. Primarily, we're talking, of course, about reducing the threat of overfishing or managing the threat of overfishing. So really moving fisheries to sustainability, conserving threatened species, which is probably the usage that we've seen so far, protecting livelihood opportunities, whether fishing or tourism. And I think a really important point here is that that while spatial protection may seem sort of blindingly obvious, you know, it's hardly a new approach. If you look at the research that has been done into the effectiveness of existing shark and ray MPAs, and particularly the many large shark sanctuaries in the Pacific, quite a number of these occupying entire economic EEZs, such as Palau. It's actually very difficult to tell how effective they are because in many cases they don't have objectives that are specific enough to be measured, right? And they don't necessarily have the monitoring programs in place to be able to monitor changes in the sharks and rays themselves, but also you know, if there are fisheries objectives or social objectives, whether or not those are being measured as well. So that's a key point. It's not that they are necessarily ineffective, it's just that they're very difficult to say have been because there are no stated goals. And as we'll see, there are legitimate goals that may not be directly related to the sharks, but may relate to livelihoods, tourism and other things. So really a sort of underutilized approach with huge potential. So as of 2018, James Cook University showed that there were around 38 dedicated shark and ray MPAs. So these are ones that are really have a strong focus on sharks and rays, not just MPAs that may have sharks and rays within them. They actually cover a very large area, 6% of the ocean surface, primarily because of these very large shark sanctuaries occupying EEZs. And as I said, difficult to assess management effectiveness. And there is one particular paper that reviews all of that, which is kind of interesting. So in order to try and look at MPA effectiveness in another way, the James Cook team that I mentioned took a different slant of really looking at sort of people's perceptions by interviewing experts, government, NGOs and others, people involved with MPAs and with shark and ray MPAs. And I've just pulled out sort of two key findings from this, one of which is that if you look at the graph at the bottom, factors believed to influence success, you'll see that support and buy-in from the community was viewed even higher than the biological factors, and even higher than enforcement, which is something that people talk about probably more than anything as dictating success or failure. So there's a key lesson there. And the paper found that even though it was the opinion of people that that was the most important one, if you look at sort of how these existing shark and MPAs have come about, most attention has actually been put on the biophysical factors. So the sort of biology of the animals and the size of the MPA and things like that. So there's a bit of a disconnect there that we can learn from and should learn from moving forwards. And that comes through very clearly through our new guide. Another perspective on this was a particular case study. So when we did the Shark and Ray Tourism Guide a number of years ago, I went to Malapascua in the Philippines, which at that time was the only place you could dive with shark and rays. And I interviewed fishermen, I interviewed dive operators. And it sort of has an interesting history, Malapascua, because the site was discovered by divers, I think in the late 1990s. By 2002, there was an MPA established on this underwater reef where the thresher sharks are most often seen, but it really had almost no enforcement in the initial times. And I remember seeing a video from a friend diving at this place. Actually, one of the thresher sharks was actually caught right in front of his eyes and brought back up to the boat. So some serious sort of conflicts between users there. Some of the dive operators understandably got fed up with the situation and they sort of took matters into their own hands. They started charging tourists a small fee and really very effectively they started buying patrol boats and they started employing ex-fishermen as staff and they started enforcing the no-take zone, but they barely consulted with the fishermen. And when I was doing the interviews in 2017, some of the fishermen were still pretty bitter about it. They'd had some conflicts along the way, but they had at least recognized by that time, you know, after 5+ sort of hard years, that there were benefits from the thresher shark tourism that were actually coming through to the community in a beneficial way. But I mean, even the dive operators themselves acknowledged that they would have had an easier time in the long term if they'd spent more time at the beginning discussing it with the fishermen. So you can understand that they just wanted to move things forward and they were pretty fed up, but it caused them quite a lot of pain along the way. So getting buy-in, very important. So yes, this is, this is sort of surprisingly their first dedicated guide to MPAs. We've really sort of tried to make use, as I said, of the latest sort of research. And one of the other areas of research that James Cook undertook was to collect pretty much all the movement data, so shark and ray movement information. And there are some references in the guide where you can look at that. So we've been able to incorporate, not in a sort of technical way, but in a sort of more general way, that sort of information on movement, very much intended to be a sort of practical guide that anybody can sort of pick up with minimal scientific training. And the other important point is that it really covers both existing and new MPAs. I was asked this at the beginning of the call, who is really the target audiences for this? So it's sort of the national fisheries and environment managers, RFMOs. I think certainly on the fisheries side, as a fisheries management tool, very underutilized. I'm not aware of any RFMO yet using spatial protection for sharks. And NGOs, but also the tourism and dive operators as well in certain situations. So the guide, explores sort of key uses and spends quite a lot of time talking about sort of how to achieving spatial fisheries, helping to achieve spatial sustainable fisheries management, whether these are targeted shark fisheries or non-targeted, and quite a lot of discussion. Some of you may be aware about how MSC deals with shark finning in MSC fisheries. That's quite a hot topic at the moment. And of course, conservation of shark and ray species and critical habitats. And of course, because this is a WWF call, I mean, all this is obviously geared towards supporting outcomes 1 and 2 for the ocean practice. I think one of the key points as well is that spatial protection is most likely to be effective if it's actually sort of used in conjunction with other management tools. It may not be possible for the sharks and rays that move larger distances, obviously, to have MPAs that cover all of their range. So having protected areas for critical habitats, and then perhaps focusing on other management outside, including fisheries bycatch mitigation, is likely to be the most effective. And yes, I'm not going to go into this, but just to highlight again, really the importance of defining goals and objectives. And this, of course, is relevant to MPAs generally, not just for sharks and rays, but yes, looking at the literature and the reviews so far, you'd be surprised how sort of high level and vision-like a lot of the goals for these shark sanctuaries in particular are. So yes, in terms of the movement patterns, I think it's quite a nice graphic here, just sort of illustrating not necessarily a straight line direction, but in terms of the areas used by different animals, and this is obviously a very important consideration. Being very clear about what species you're trying to protect, if possible, will have a big determination on what a relevant size might actually be. And not just for individual MPAs, but of course for connectivity potentially between MPAs that have the opportunity to conserve the same species in different parts of its range. I think one of despite the fact that some of these animals do move very large areas, there's been some interesting examples where actually in the right place for the right species, very small MPAs can be quite effective, particularly where we're talking about nursery areas or areas where species aggregate. The grey nurse shark or the raggy-tooth shark in Australia, they've identified, I think it's around 20 aggregation areas where small groups of that species aggregate in very set places pretty much every day, and then the animals go off and hunt at night. So identifying those places and putting some level of protection around them can be those critical habitats can be very effective. So the message is not that shark and ray MPAs have to be very large. And perhaps more sort of diverse range of goals are possible than you might possibly think. I mean, from restoring single endangered species, protecting nursery and other critical habitats, finding areas, sort of biodiversity hotspots for sharks and rays and conserving a diverse range of species, very specifically reducing mortality in fisheries, whether targeted or not, but also socio-economic angles, shark and ray focused tourism, and there's some, there's an example within the guide itself of perhaps focusing on edge species. So these are species that are evolutionarily distinct, and there's an idea that if you protect those species, then you will preserve a fuller array of genetic diversity within this large family, and that's something that ZSL in particular is promoting at the moment. So focus on edge species is also another way of looking at this. In terms of national plans of action for sharks, just want to make a quick point here that MPAs have the opportunity to contribute to the first 6 out of the 10 principles, which I think is quite impressive. And also that's on a national scale, on an international scale, whether it's CITES or CMS species, or sort of on a higher level contributing to CBD or SDGs. Spatial protection for sharks and rays certainly has a role to play. So just in case you're wondering, for CITES, which of course is all focused on trade, for those species that a country decides that it still wants to export, they need to show that any fisheries and the trade is done sustainably. So spatial protection that can help contribute to the sustainability of the fishery would help contribute to a country meeting its CITES obligations. Okay, and I just want to make the point that this guide was designed to really link where there's natural synergy with the 2 other guides that we produced. So the tourism guide has a really good section, or a strong section on social license and getting buy-in from communities. So rather than repeat that in the guide, we point to the tourism guide. And the rapid assessment toolkit is a swathe of tools for collecting different kinds of shark and ray information. So, landings, genetics, but particularly shark movements as well. So I think, if you were planning an MPA and you wanted to think about shark movements, looking at that toolkit is a great place to start. And I'm going to stop there, I think, see if there's any initial questions. And I'm also just going to shut the door, which somebody opened. It's being a bit noisy. I'm still here.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. I think that was a brief but very good overview of the guide. Does anyone have questions or comments or experiences that they want to share?
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Andy, can you maybe, I think I will never design a shark and ray design just for that purpose, but I work with other MPAs. So can you maybe just say what are the key factors to make an existing MPAs effective for sharks and rays?
Well, I think like MPAs in general, I mean, effectiveness can be something to do with the health of the animals itself, and looking at, either keeping populations healthy or restoring depleted populations. So strictly speaking, in terms of in terms of making it sure it's effective, you just need to be very clear about what the objective actually is, and then ensure that you have monitoring to, to just see whether or not those objectives have been achieved. But I mean, as we'll see from the case studies, and will be nothing new to you, I mean, we may well have objectives that are not related directly to the sharks and rays, but are more socio-economic in nature.
Hello, Andy.
Hi, Yoga.
Yeah, I am adding the question, same with before. So I'm agree that the MPA for sharks have to put a target conservation. So based on the experience in Komodo itself, when we starting developing the management plan for sharks and rays, there is some indicator that we should answer. It's about benefit sharing among the fishermen and the tourism activity on the locations. That I just think that how we gonna assess the outcome or impact about does the MPA for sharks are benefit for the fishermen that literally they have a bycatch for the sharks, and the other area is a main objective for tourism. Some the management plans mostly only benefit in one side. It's only benefit for the industrial, for tourism, but it's always struggling with the fishermen that that landing the sharks because they doesn't want it. So you already mentioned that we have to acknowledge the fishermen or the community involved in the process. But the question from the community, what is the benefit for us if we also protect the sharks? Because all the money comes to the industrials. So that's the thing, the case. Maybe you have any experience, or it could answer in the guideline in shark and tourism guideline, but also it linked with the MPA for sharks guideline. Thank you, Andy.
Sure, no problem. I mean, maybe the best thing I can do is just give a couple of examples. And I think one really important lesson from the case studies that we did for the tourism guide is that even if a community benefits from new tourism jobs, it is rarely the fishermen that get those jobs. So the fishermen may be well suited to driving the dive boats, but they may not speak the languages that the tourists come from, and the sort of the service culture may not be so well suited to people who've been very independent, and sort of been able to do their own thing and report to themselves. I mean, this is what was talked back to us. So in the case in Malapascua, the fishermen were basically saying, well, we haven't directly benefited. Some of us are driving tourism boats now, but there's not that many of those jobs going. But they said that what they really acknowledged was that their children were finding jobs in the tourism sector. So it's just something to bear in mind. I think one interesting model which has been very successful, but I'm not sure, I don't think it will be applicable to everywhere, is Shark Reef in Fiji. So this is one of the ones that we used quite extensively, and you're probably aware of this, is that there is a fee that is collected by the tourism operators for every diver who goes in. It's basically a small marine protected area where you can see a diverse array of sharks. And that MPA was set up with the agreement of, I think it was 2 villages that were fishing in that area. And the villagers get cash compensation for not fishing in that area. So all of those fees that are collected are given directly to the community. In that particular community, the The Fijian elders of the village decide themselves how that money will be spent. The dive operator has no say in that. And so hopefully that money is distributed in a way that the community can enjoy, although, you know, it's not a cash payment to everybody in that village. It's a cash payment to the village who then decides what to do with it. And in that case, the amount of funding coming in has been sufficient that the communities are happy, that it more than compensates for the area that they've lost. And actually there's at least one other village that has wanted to join the scheme. So just a couple of, I guess, examples.
Yeah, so the models like PAS, payment ecosystem services, like or TORF or something else. Okay, thanks.
My pleasure. So Melly, can you see hands if people are raising hands?
Yes, and at the moment, Sam has a question. Sam, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Andy. Fantastic presentation and a really exciting area of work. I wanted to just share with you that your point around the challenge of measuring effectiveness when you don't have clear goals. And you know, actually, WWF South Africa is busy doing a project that's reviewing global best practice on how to develop useful goals and frameworks across ecological, socioeconomic, etc., which may be of interest. And it really struck us that there's actually very little good guidance on developing this. There is some good guidance for tropical marine protected areas, but very little beyond, you know, protected areas that move beyond coral reefs. And so I thought that might be of interest to you. And a real struggle in South Africa to measure effectiveness, but also you know, justify marine protected area existence, because we can't prove that they're effective. Because you can't prove they're effective because you don't have any goals to measure them against. And so this, I think, this is a really big challenge. The other thing I wanted to share with you is that South Africa also has a marine protected area focused on ragged-tooth sharks at a place called Allowal Shoal. And so that might be another one if you're looking for examples of marine protected areas successfully protecting breeding aggregations, because that's been really successful. And then the last is a question. I was interested to know, what are your next steps with this? And you know, is your next step to start thinking about where you may prototype marine protected areas for sharks, or what are your plans?
The end goal of this is that we would like to see that the existing MPAs, where possible, you know, are more effective in the terms that we talked about, but really to see an expansion of MPAs. So I didn't dwell on this perhaps as much as I should have, but you know, okay, so we have 38 MPAs covering, you know, maybe 6% of the ocean surface, which is massive, but think about the thousands or tens of thousands of fisheries taking sharks, and the fact that we've got 25% of more than 1,000 species threatened with extinction. There's so much more opportunity to be using them, you know, whether it's for threatened species or whether it's for improving fisheries management. They are almost non-existent for offshore fisheries, in particularly on the high seas. So I think one of the aims of this guide is that we want people to be more comfortable with spatial protection as a tool, and realize that it's perhaps a bit more versatile. It's not just about protecting coral reefs so that people can go and dive with reef sharks, which is what a lot of them sort of focused on at the moment. So our next immediate steps are most focused on getting the guide out there. So I've been working with the teams, and we're going to be distributing hard copies at CCSBT, WCPFC, IOTC, ICAT, and looking for other opportunities, particularly regional fisheries meetings where we can get this out. There's of course quite a lot of WF teams, increasing number, working on MPAs for sharks and rays. So we hope this is useful for them. That's sort of about as far as we've got, apart from the initiative that you helped with around shark recoveries. This will be a tool there. So that's sort of what's on our radar at the moment. We haven't been thinking about specific tools or, I don't know, perhaps big advocacy around it. Apart from that, I think we want to sort of get it out there. It's obviously only been out for a week or so, and then sort of see how it goes apart from those things I mentioned already. But ideas are always very welcome, and you're never short of ideas, Sam, which is great.
Great. I do see a couple more hands. Jessica and Shawit. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. I know that Jessica needs to leave a little bit earlier, so please go ahead, Jessica.
Thank you. A great presentation, Andy. As you know, I'm working on the High Seas Oceans Treaty at the UN, and we're looking at how this treaty can help migratory species across their whole range. So in terms of both marine protected areas, but also other tools to avoid adverse effects on sharks and other migratory species as they cross between jurisdictions and cross areas where there is human activity. So I think this tool, this guide, is really interesting for that purpose as well. And perhaps we can have a discussion about a tool that we are producing, which is trying to illustrate what happens to a migratory species, and we will use a shark we'll also use other migratory species such as a seabird, probably an albatross, and a cetacean, etc., turtle, to illustrate what happens to these animals when they cross the oceans from coasts into the high seas and into various areas where things are happening to them, and how the treaty can help. I'll keep you all posted on that, and if you want to know more, or maybe you can help us to make sure that we actually make something that is useful for all of you working in shark conservation, please get in touch with me. It will be some kind of an infographic, I think.
That sounds fantastic, and I think for your example, your shark example, my immediate off the top of the head is look at short fin mako. There's a number of studies where researchers were just trying to look at the migrations of short fin makos and were tagging individuals, and an amazing majority ended up being caught by industrial fishing vessels, which is actually really led to the alarm. And I can think of at least 2 studies I can... Okay.
If you can flick them my way, that'd be fantastic. And then we can, if anybody else has any interest in contributing or just, reviewing as well, would be really helpful. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll do. I'll get that to you tomorrow also.
Great. Thank you. And I think one last question. Shall I? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Marlo. Hello, everyone. Marlo and Andy. Yeah, thanks for the excellent presentation. And I have reviewed this documents. So just skimmed through it, and I got another question. And before that question, let me share that Pakistan has declared an MPA, which is called Astola Island, a few years back. And that's not based on, it wasn't only for the coral reef, but there are a few patches of coral reefs, hard and soft. But it was, dedicatedly, declared for a potential site for the cetaceans and as a nesting ground for the green sea turtle, and most important for to achieve the Aichi targets of biodiversity. So that we have a declared MPA in Pakistan. So yeah, we are going to to develop the plan of action for the Astola Island as well. So that's underway. So the next point that I was just trying to link with the dots with it, that Pakistan has already passed a law which is called deep sea fishing policy. That was, just to promote sustainable fisheries and somehow decrease the numbers of the trawlers. But what happened like that? It is reflected negatively. So some of the fishermen that went for a strike against this law. So my question is that, for example, we are going such kind of, I don't know if this guideline is, covering those aspects. Like, for example, we have created a deep sea policy. If it was a conflict from the fishermen against this law. Similarly, we got another example that, the conflict has, when sharks were protected in the Maldives. So there was a conflict which has resulted in the unregulated import of and export of shark product as souvenir from the Maldives, and potentially providing incentives for the illegal exploitation of local sharks. So I'm wondering that, if these aspects were covered in this guidelines, or maybe, they could be added up later somehow.
Yeah, look, interesting real world examples. I mean, I think some of let me put it this way. I mean, I guess the MPA guide describes a process more than anything else, and things that you need to be considered within that. There are case studies which give examples of where things have worked well and where things have not worked so well. But it's not really able to sort of guide, I guess, on really sort of specific difficulties like that. I mean, I don't know how much the fishermen were consulted before that was put in place, but it sounds like they maybe hadn't bought into the idea prior to that deep sea fishing policy being put in place. And, as fishermen and anybody else would do, have reacted against it. So, sort of yes in terms of process, but no, not in terms of specifics, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. My question was because, when I was in the Maldives, so I heard that, even, in Indian Ocean, the Maldives are considered as a champion in terms of protection of the sharks and, protected, species. But, I heard that, there are some group of fishermen which are just, coming up with the aggressively that they are going to start fishing of sharks. So that was, that's the result of the conflict. So I thought maybe, this kind of, conflict could be, just somehow covered or maybe advised in this guideline. Is it any possibility?
Let me think about it. I think you'd understand that I'm not keen to suddenly expand the guide when we've only released it last week. But there may be other ways of thinking about how we can sort of provide solutions to the things that come up along the way. Obviously the example of the Maldives, where they're thinking about allowing some shark fishermen, just really goes to show that the fishermen are clearly not feeling the benefits of the tourism.
Yeah, exactly.
All right,
thank you, Andy.
That's your question.
Any questions?
I have a question. Andy,
Go ahead.
Is this only in English at the moment? Is there any plan to roll it out in, say, Spanish and French, or Spanish?
Yeah, great question. So we do have funding to translate this into Spanish, French, and Bahasa Indonesia.
Good.
And I was also speaking to our Brazilian colleagues and saying that if they could handle the process, I could probably find some funding to get it translated into Portuguese as well. So
good.
That's very much the intention.
I do have a question, Andy. Again, Gustavo from Colombia. So, hi. So we have fisheries, like shark fisheries. And my question would be if you have examples of areas where this, the sustainability in these shark fisheries is being sought or is being trying to be achieved in some areas, because for us, there's a fisheries that we cannot neglect. And I think in our case, in the Pacific coast of Colombia, what we would like to look is to make these fisheries sustainable. And I think that would be a way of working together with the communities. So I don't know if you would think of an example that we could take where this search for sustainability is being successful or being achieved?
Can I just ask you quickly, are they pelagic sharks, or are they reef sharks or coastal sharks?
Well, quickly, there are a couple of MPAs, coastal MPAs close to mangrove areas. And there are longline fisheries, but very, very coastal, that operate where you get a lot of rays, which have commercial value. And what else? Like small demersal sharks that have also commercial value. So the fishery is continuing, and I think enforcement in those areas is very difficult. So you have to really work together with the community to make the fisheries sustainable.
Okay, I mean, for countries where catch limits may not be realistic, our basic sort of strategy that we're sort of trying at the moment is to have critical habitats protected. And a great example that's relevant to your area is for scalloped hammerheads, protecting the mangroves and the estuaries where, that are used as the nursery grounds, and then trying to look at bycatch mitigation for areas outside. And some very interesting work that's going on in the network, including in Pakistan, looking at LED lights on gill nets to reduce the catch of sharks. I think generally, the countries that are making the best efforts on sustainable shark fisheries are the US and Australia. So that would be where I would start to look in answer to your question. I'm not so familiar with those countries that I'd be able to pick out examples kind of on the top of my head where spatial protection is a key part of that. But it's an interesting question. I'm happy to have a look.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, I think case studies are always useful for, trying to turn the sort of theory into practicality. And there are some examples within the guide, but I'm not sure whether they answer that exact question. So I will have a look.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the good questions and active participation. We have a little less time than expected for the case studies, which is not a problem at all. So I'll briefly explain the process. So Andy's prepared 2 imaginary case studies. So I'm going to divide you up in 2 groups. Andy's going to join one group and I'm going to join the other group. And we're going to read through the case studies and then together brainstorm about next steps, potential solutions, opportunities for that MPA. And then we're going to come back. You'll get a notification that we've got 60 seconds left. Come back, report back. So I think we'll have a small 10 minutes in the breakout group. So please watch your screen because you'll have to accept the invitation for the breakout group. Okay, let me see.
So am I going to describe them quickly first?
Oh yeah, please, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Andy. Yeah.
No problem at all. So I'll keep this quick. So you don't get to choose which case study you do. So we're not going to go through them both in detail now. Hopefully you've had a chance to read them. They were emailed out to you, so you'll probably have to look at those. So these are imaginary. They are both for imaginary existing MPAs. And this particular process, which is described, which is in the guide, may be of some sort of use. But I think based on the discussion we've had already about the importance of objectives, you get the idea. So the first case study, and I'm not going to read through this, is basically an island nation that has decided that it wanted to protect its sharks primarily for the purpose of tourism and to benefit the people of Kurumba through that tourism. There isn't, it's been in place for 5 years. There's a complete ban on the capturing of sharks within the entire EEZ, which is huge, 50,000 square kilometers, but there is other fishing going on for tuna by foreign fleets. They're not monitoring, but there is, and they're mostly in the enforcement is mostly limited inspections of catches. All right, so they don't have a lot of patrol boats out exploring the EEZ. No dedicated monitoring at the moment, but the fishermen are the foreign fishing vessels are required to report any capture sharks to the RFMO. It seems to be going quite well in terms of the tourism. They're getting about 50,000 divers per year. However, there was recently a big seizure of shark fin, and this has attracted the attention of a wealthy tourist, who's offered the government $500,000 US to increase the effectiveness of its shark fishing ban. So if WF were involved in this, what could they do? The second example is an older marine park on a continental shelf. It's much smaller, around 200 square kilometers. And it was, even though it includes 40 species of sharks and ray, it wasn't designated specifically for sharks and rays. It was designated more basically to protect the rich biodiversity, but also to ensure that fisheries are sustainable and support communities in and around this particular marine park. You've got two zones, conservation zones, which are effectively no-take zones, and mixed-use zones where fishers from nearby villages can fish. Conservation zones were designated at the start of when the BMP was first designated, and they're just areas that had the highest overall biodiversity. They cover about 20%, the rest is mixed. In this particular case, the Marine Park Authority decided to update the management plan. They want to add a shark-specific objective and focus on a few particular species, which are mentioned here. And basically, we want to know what kind of process could the authority go through to establish a shark and ray objective that is consistent with the park goal. All right, and you can read through the sort of rest in detail. So that's your overview. You are not going to be able to finish this. There's no expectation you're going to be able to finish this, but hopefully 10 minutes you can sort of come up with what the initial steps should look like to get the process to get this going.
All right, great. Just watch your screens and accept my invitation, please. Hi, everyone. Welcome back in the main session. We've only got a few minutes left, so let's do a very quick report back from the different case studies. I hope you had nice discussions. I think we did. We had input from quite a few people, and I think, Andy, in our case, your presentation was very well reflected in the suggestions. So people suggested really looking into data of existing shark species and also through time to make sure that the management plan is adjusted to the data that's available and there are clear objectives. People suggested if there's no dedicated monitoring yet, that should be done, and also to involve the tourism industry. So the tourism boats to get involved in monitoring, which was a good suggestion. And also somebody suggested to look into the case itself, the seizure of the sharks, where it went wrong, to see what could be improved, look at the drivers and the threats. So those were just a few key points that were mentioned in our case. Thank you for your great contributions. It was a really nice discussion, actually.
Excellent, yes. So I can report back quickly from our group. So we did the second case study. So basically it seemed that for the reef sharks in this area, there probably was going to be some existing data from the fishing surveys that had been come up. So we could look at that data and see whether there seemed to be particular hotspots on the reef where more sharks are being caught than others. And potentially think about doing some protection from those, although we wouldn't know what species they were. For the zonation, so with the conservation zones may not cover so well that the mangroves and the estuaries where these guitar fish and things seem to be. So there was a suggestion that we could use the rapid assessment toolkit to look at tools that might allow us to look at the movements and sort of locations to find out where they might be. And Serena, I'd love to, can you finish us off, because you were, sorry, we cut you off as we came back to the main breakout group. Could you just share your idea with us all?
Yeah, I guess it's just too much to say in a short time. I think it was already mentioned earlier. I think even for the case study 2, the MPA goal should also include long-term monitoring for all the species that they were interested to look at, for the guitar fishes and as well as for the stingrays. Because I think if we don't have sufficient enough baseline, we can't tell whether the zonation works within the MPA, and the zonation might change based on the baseline that you're collected. So yeah, I think long-term monitoring using the rapid assessment toolkit should be included as part of the overarching goals of the MPA. That's all for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just a key point there, I think, for both of the case studies, that it's so important to sort of break down the goal into its constituent parts and make sure that you have objectives for the socio-economic components, as well as the the shark and ray populations and that kind of thing. So, and that I think is often overlooked. So, great job, everyone.
We also had a discussion on the Karumba case, on how to improve the effectiveness of the shark fishing ban. And I think we got a couple of very nice reflections from situations in countries where people work themselves, how that would play out in their own situations. So Gustavo from Ecuador, am I saying it right? No, Colombia, right, Gustavo?
Yeah, Colombia.
Colombia. Mentioned that there's not so much tourism in the area he works on, so it's quite different. But we talked quite a bit about the socioeconomic value of sharks, so needing to have clear goals and objectives, and of course then also data on that side of things to make the case to people, to the fishermen, to the local communities, what alive sharks are worth, and why it's also in their benefit to increase the effectiveness of the shark ban. So that was an interesting discussion. Then in our case, there weren't very clear objectives for the shark ban. So the goal is to conserve sharks, but it doesn't say which sharks, the number of sharks, what is actually conserving. So we talked about making those targets or objectives more clear, both for the ecological side of things as well as the socioeconomic one. And we also talked about looking at the drivers. So why did this actually happen? This large, what is the word? The taking of the sharks. Why did that happen? Is there a certain market for it? How can we address that? And then it was Nadia, I think, from Belize, who also said, okay, how can we involve that fishing sector into tourism, monitoring, so we can create alternative livelihoods and involve them in making that shark ban more effective. And then I think you were about to start saying something about feeding of sharks, which would be very interesting to still hear right now in this group.
Yeah, I was saying from the tourism portion of things, one of the things that they've been using in Belize to attract tourists to shark sanctuaries is the feeding of sharks, which I think can be dangerous, as well as it affects the behavioral patterns for the sharks. So it's not something, while it attracts tourists and attracts income from tourism, it could be something negative as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think, Andy, that's probably also partly where the other guide comes in on sustainable tourism for sharks and rays.
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the feeding of sharks and attracting them in other ways, it's not just feeding. Sometimes it's people making noises, just making specific noises underwater, is certainly one of the more controversial aspects. The responsible tourism guide doesn't say that feeding is good or bad. It says that it will definitely have an impact on the behavior, and that you know, that if it's not necessary to feed, you definitely shouldn't do it. But we do acknowledge that there are some places where you just would never see these sharks in a predictable way if you weren't feeding them or something like that. So there is a sort of process that you can work through in one of the tools in that tourism guide to try and work out how to make sure that any impact on the animals, but also on safety, certainly an issue as well, is managed carefully. I think just quickly on your case study, I think there's some other interesting things going on. It's not very clear how much local fishing of sharks is going on, and it's certainly the case in Palau that locals are still allowed to catch sharks, which is not something that's very widely known. And the fact that you've actually probably got quite a good data set from the foreign fleets that are fishing the sharks means that, okay, that's only been in place for 5 years, but you know, you could probably start to look at from the catches and sort of answer questions about whether shark populations are going down, you know, whether that fishing is actually having a negative impact or whether the populations are staying the same. So there's probably some quite interesting questions you could ask with that data, and it's, you know, it's bringing in revenue to the country, so possibly some of that revenue could be used to actually on the enforcement, sorry, on a monitoring program to look at the effects of the shark ban. So, you know, you can go endlessly deep into these things, but I hope you found it fun and stimulating. Okay, so the sorts of discussions we had. I think firstly we realized that we needed a bit more data, and it seemed that there's monitoring going on of the fishery, but sharks are not being recorded to species. So we're going to do what our Guyana's colleagues are doing and actually have a species ID guide, and train the people who are carrying it out to be able to collect information on species. So that will be useful. For another method of getting species level data is perhaps citizen science. So if there's tourism in the area, dive tourism in the area, perhaps working with the operators to try and get them to record the kinds of species that they're occurring. For these guitar fishes and this ray which may be in the water that's not so clear, maybe we can use the BRUVs, the baited remote underwater video, maybe do a bit of tagging work, that kind of stuff. And I think using that kind of information, have a look at see whether the zoning makes sense for sharks and rays. So the zoning that was put in this park was sort of very general and based on old surveys. So it seems quite likely that some of that zonation might want to change a bit. We talked a bit about the sort of socio-economic side of things. So the Barents Marine Park has a specific components about sustainable fisheries and sort of community benefits for those in the area. So starting to think about sort of more socio-economic side of things, and using the same data that we thought about earlier to try and see whether fisheries are sustainable. If not, maybe put some more management measures in. But conversely, you know, if there's potential to increase the sustainable take, maybe we allow that. So it could go both ways. And I think Rab had the great idea at the end that if everything seems to be going well, let's think about expanding the total area of this marine park beyond the 200 square kilometers. So that was a nice flourish.